The grid control at first looks like every other control. I'm going to double click the grid to cause it to become the activated element so I get the grid adorners on it. Unlike the canvas and the other layout containers, the grid has got the two additional bars, one to the left and one above, as well as a small icon that right now informs us that we're in canvas layout mode. I'm going to click that and switch over to grid layout mode. Now look what happens when I move my number 1 control into the grid. As soon as it's moved into the grid, a handful of new adorners display some new information for me. Right now, the information is telling me that my button is going to stay about 95 pixels from the top, 106 pixels from the left, and 100 pixels from the bottom. You'll notice that these numbers are also displayed over here in the Property Inspector. To the right of the number 1 is a dotted line and what looks like a broken link. This indicates that the distance between the right side of my control and the right side of the grid is variable, and it can change. I can change any of these margins from hard values, which are values that won't change, to a soft value that can change just by clicking on those links. You'll notice when I clicked on the left link, the right link became solid. For a grid to lay everything out, it has to know information in both directions from at least one source. By making the left link a soft link, it no longer had information on where to position my number, and it figured since I didn't care about the left margin, I must care about the right margin. Now when I select my grid and resize it, you'll notice that the number 1 will always remain at that distance from the right and top of my grid. So long as there are no row or column dividers in a grid, the margins will always be from the current location to the edges of the grid. But I can add row or column dividers at any time, and now the margins will move to that instead of the opposite edge. If it was my intent for the margin to link to the right side of the grid instead of to the column separator, I can modify the column span property in the Property Inspector. By setting the value to 2, I now state that my control exists in both of those cells. Since before the margin was 27 pixels from the rightmost portion that the control recognized, now that it recognized the right edge of the grid, it jumped to 27 pixels from the right edge of the grid. When I select the grid and change the size of it, you'll notice that both columns increase and decrease in size. This is because both columns are what is called star-sized. This means each one will get its appropriate percentage of the size of the grid. The two unlocked locks at the top of the grid indicate this. By clicking them, I can change from star-sized to pixel-sized, and this will establish that that column will keep its size regardless of how big the grid happens to get. The grid's row and column dividers are guidelines to help you lay things out. These column dividers, however, being only guidelines, there's nothing stopping you from moving the elements on top of these dividers. When I run my application, you'll see that the elements in the grid move around based on how I'm moving my application window. So as the application gets wider or narrower, the grid maintains its margin from the layout route, and Control 1 maintains its margin to the right side of the grid. Control 2, however, as it's attached to the left, maintains its distance from the grid and the grid's subsequent distance from the edge of the window. Just as each of the elements inside the grid have its margins, the grid itself has its margins from the layout route. So when the layout route is the activated element and I select my grid, you'll see its margins displayed as well. Layout containers can live inside of each other to any arbitrary depth. So sometimes it may be useful to put a stack panel, for instance, inside of a grid, so that as the grid changes around, the stack panel will stay where it's supposed to be relative to the rest of the application, but the elements inside it are relayed out as they're supposed to be. When you're working with layout containers, the activated element, or the element with the yellow box over in the object tree, will always receive the new elements that are created. The layout route by default being selected means that if I create a new rectangle, it will be created as a child of the layout route. However, if I double-click my grid and make it the activated element, the rectangle that I draw will end up as a child of it. This is evident by the indentation displayed over here in the object tree. The snap lines that we discussed earlier to help you get the padding against the sides of your window are also there for the grid. So as I move my rectangle close to the edges of the grid, or even a grid line, the pink bars show up to help me get the right spacing from the edges of my layout container. Now that we've taken a look at the different layout managers, you should start to gain an idea of how these layout managers can work together to help you build very dynamic user interfaces that will change as the user resizes the application to their particular needs.